So this is going to be part 2 of our Intro to Arduino unit. Some essential questions we'll be answering during this lesson. What is code and why do we learn how to code? How do we code using Arduino programming language? So we've already last lesson talked about Arduino, but we didn't mention anything about Arduino's programming language or coding or programming the Arduino at all. And then what are some common Arduino commands and what are their functions? So first off, what is code? Code is a computing language used to create commands and actions a computer program can interpret. So you're giving specific and detailed instructions to a computer in order to tell it what you want to do. So it's a completely different language that a computer can understand. There are some people that kind of argue that a programming class can also or should count as some sort of language class because you kind of are really learning a different language, just as if you were learning Spanish or French or something like that. And why should we learn how to code? I think, and some of you may agree, that coding is fun and it's definitely different than something you would do in a different class in school. It also can open your eyes to different career opportunities. There are so many different career opportunities in the coding and programming field nowadays. It's definitely a booming industry. You can also get really creative with Arduino and programming and come up with a lot of fun projects and create a lot of interesting prototypes that you could use around your house and that you can use in your everyday life. And it also helps us develop computational thinking skills, which is just something that everyone as a part of society should kind of develop at some point within their life. So when we're talking about the Arduino pins send and receive electricity. So just as we plugged components into our breadboard and I called those pins, I'm also going to refer as the little kind of squares on the Arduino board where you can stick wires into. Those are also called pins. So we use those pins to kind of create circuits, send and receive electricity, and those circuits that we create are able to kind of process the programs that we write. And like I said, the code controls those pins. So if we're looking at this picture here, if we're thinking in English, we want to switch pin 7 to high, which may turn on an LED. But in code, turning on that LED or switching that pin 7 to high would look like this line of code, which says digital write 7 high. So these two mean the same thing, but we can argue that they're written in different languages. And we're going to kind of slowly introduce our new language as we move forward with Arduino. So Blink is commonly the first program that new Arduinos start with. When you load Arduino onto your computer, most of the time we start with the Blink program just because it's a great introduction to some of the more common kind of lines of code that you can use with Arduino. So what I'm going to do in this lesson is I'm going to walk you through this program, like I said, to introduce a few basic Arduino commands before we get into writing our own code. Okay, so this is kind of going to be an example, and then the activity or lab we do after this, you're going to be able to use this directly to complete the lab. So like I said, the first program, Blink, with pin 13, you're just turning a single LED on and off, and you can kind of see it here on the Arduino board. There's one LED that's built into the Arduino board, and that can be wired through pin 13 on the Arduino board, and you see the flashing light on the Arduino board. We program that. So if we're taking a look at the code on the right of this picture here, there's kind of two kind of sets or two kind of parts of code. We need to, tell the microprocessor something to do before we start the program, and then we write some sort of loop that runs forever. So before we start our program, we want to tell the Arduino that pin 13 is going to be an output. Okay, so we need to kind of initialize that in the beginning of our code. So we have to tell the computer, hey, pin 13 is being used as an output in this program. That's it. Then we have our forever loop, or a program that runs continuously until you disconnect the Arduino or reset the Arduino or turn the Arduino off. So in the loop, we want to switch pin 13 to high and wait half a second. Switching pin 13 to high will turn the LED on. Then the next line of code in the loop, we're switching pin 13 to low and waiting another half a second. Okay? Turning pin 13 or switching pin 13 to low turns the LED off. If we didn't add these wait commands, everything would be happening so fast it would just look like the LED is constantly on. You wouldn't be able to see kind of the off portion of kind of this code. So we do need to add those quote unquote wait commands in there in order to see something happening on the Arduino. So this is kind of the code in English, or like sentences that we can understand at this point. Now let's take a look at the code kind of in Arduino language. So Arduino is a version of C or C++ programming language. You may have experience with this. Even though Arduino uses kind of specific commands, it can be applied to many other languages or microprocessors that use a similar language. So we're focusing on Arduino programming language right now, but it can be applied to many other different microprocessors or softwares or anything like that. So what we're actually going to do is I'm just going to walk you through this program. Now this is a super short program. A lot of the programs we write are going to be, double in length. There's not that many lines here, but like I said, it's a common first program that we use to introduce new Arduino users to programming language. So the code breakdown, like I said, the first thing that happens is some sort of, before we start, or telling the Arduino a few different things before it runs its forever loop. So in Arduino language, we call that the void setup. Okay, so it's a setup command. It runs only once, and it's where you identify pins as either inputs or outputs. You'll notice that all the setup commands are placed in curly brackets. So we have void setup, and you always need these parentheses here. You have a curly bracket to open the line of code. You have your code, and then you have a curly bracket that ends the void setup. So right now we only have one line of code in the void setup. You may have 10 lines of code in the void setup, but it always starts with a curly bracket. Then you have all your lines of code. After your final line of setup code, you have your ending curly bracket. And you'll also notice that each line ends with a semicolon. The void setup command doesn't have a semicolon here, but each line of code does have a semicolon. So in this void setup here, we're initializing pin 13 as an output. We're using a pin mode command, which I'll get into in a little bit. Then after we have our setup functions, we have our loop. So like I said, the loop runs continuously right after the setup, and it controls the functions of different pins. It runs continuously after you turn on the Arduino Uno or after each new program upload. This loop won't stop unless you unplug the Arduino or hit the reset button or download a new program. And again, you'll see here each line of code ends with a semicolon. Same thing as the void setup. We open the void loop with a curly bracket. You write all your lines of code, and then we end the void loop again with a curly bracket after we finish all our lines of code. So the next kind of function or line of code that I want to talk about is the pin mode function. So when we're writing, the pin mode function, we write pin mode, and then we state the pin number, and then we need to initialize some sort of behavior. So that behavior can either be an input or an output. There's only two options. The behavior is always written in capitals. Capitals and punctuation, I guess I could say, in code does matter. So you'll see that pin is lowercase, then you have an uppercase M, then lowercase the rest of it. It must be like that in order for it to kind of understand what you're trying to get it to do. Then we have pin 13, that's the pin number in this example, and then we have output written in capitals. The pin number and behavior are separated by a comma. Oh, and one other thing before I move forward, the pin mode function can only be in the void setup. So you can't have necessarily a pin mode command in the void loop. It usually falls within the setup function. Another extremely common line of code is called digital write. So similarly to pin mode, we have digital in lowercase, an uppercase W, and then the rest of the line is lowercase. Then we have the pin number, comma, and then the state, okay? And just like the behavior in the pin mode function, we only had two options, either an input or an output. Here, we only have two states. It's either high or low, and that's always written in capitals as well. High is on. If we're thinking about an LED, that's turning an LED on. Low, a low state is off. And the last line of code that we can talk about for this blink function is delay. So in a delay command, you're essentially delaying or waiting something or waiting for the next line of code to kind of happen. The delay command uses milliseconds. So you write delay and then you would write the number of milliseconds in the parentheses. So it pauses the program for a certain amount of time. Delay 1000, for example, would delay the program for 1 second. So delay 500 delays your program, delay 500 delays your program for half a second. Delay 250 would delay your program for a quarter of a second. So you do write that in milliseconds. The last thing that I wanted to talk about with programs or breakdown of code in general is the writing of comments. So we always use comments within code to kind of explain what each line of code is doing in quote unquote English. So you can initialize a comment by using 2 slashes. So we can see here in this comment, it says the setup function runs once when you press reset or power the board. And then we have the setup function. After pin mode 13 output, after that line of code, we have a comment that says initialize digital pin 13 as an output. We have another comment here that says the loop function runs over and over and over again. So that's just telling you, reminder that the loop function runs over again. Then we have our comments on our loop lines of code. So we have digital write 13 high is turning the LED on. Delay 1000 is waiting for 1 second. Digital write 13 low is turning the LED off. Delay 1000 is waiting for a second. So when we are writing new lines of code, one of the things I will have you do is kind of make a line or comment on each line of code explaining in quote unquote English what the line of code is doing. So you're really just writing notes to yourself explaining what the code does, or if you were to show your program to someone who has very little experience with programming or coding, they would be able to look at your comments and kind of understand. Last but not least, I did just want to show you on Tinkercad what the Blink program would look like. So I know it's kind of hard to see, but we have our Arduino Uno. There's no breadboard connected, nothing else connected to it, but you do see that little LED, and I'll play it again. You do see that little built-in LED on the Arduino board turning on and off.